My name is Shirley Watson, 34 years old, a week away, and I came home a stranger to the house, held together by my name. New lock on my door. A stranger living in my room. My things dumped on the front lawn like trash left out for pickup. The steel box I kept under the closet floor, the one holding every dollar I'd scraped together to finally get out, sat open on the porch step, empty. "You're never home anyway," my mother said, and went back to the TV. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for the money back. I picked up the first box off the wet grass, set it in my trunk, and made one phone call from the driver's seat. They forgot something that night. They forgot that the name keeping them under that roof had never been theirs. It was mine. And when they remembered, several days later, in that same kitchen, my father's phone hit the floor so hard it skidded under the refrigerator. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before you understand why a single call could tip over everything they'd built on top of me, you have to go back 9 years, to a kitchen table, to a contract, to the first time in my life my parents ever truly needed me. And the pen they slid across the table like it was nothing. In the spring of 2016, I was 25, and I still believed that if I said yes to enough things, they would finally see me. My father had lost his job at the distribution warehouse the winter before. He'd been a floor supervisor for 11 years, and when the company restructured, he was one of the first names on the list. He didn't take it well. He stopped answering calls. The credit card balances my parents had been rolling over for years stopped rolling and started collapsing. By March, they were behind on everything, and their landlord at the time gave them notice. They needed a new place, but no landlord in that town would touch them. 2 open collections, a repossession, a credit score in the low 500s. Every application came back rejected. I remember the night they called me over. My mother had made a roast, which she only did when she wanted something. My father sat at the head of the table with a lease already printed out, the pen laid diagonally across it like a fork on a napkin. "You're the only one with clean credit," my mother said. "You have a steady job. It's just a formality, Shirley." "The house is ours," my father said. "You'd just be signing so the paperwork clears. That's all." I was an office assistant then, at an insurance brokerage, making enough to have a credit score they envied and not enough to feel like I mattered. And here was my father, who hadn't asked me for anything in years, telling me I was the only one who could fix this. My hand shook when I signed, not from fear, from something closer to gratitude. For once, I was the one holding the family up. I signed my name, Shirley Watson, as the sole tenant and financially responsible party. My parents were listed only as approved occupants with no authority to renew the lease themselves. Glenn Osborne, the landlord, shook my hand and called me the responsible one. Everyone at that table nodded like it was a joke we all understood. I understood the family version of it too. They would treat the house as theirs, and I had merely made it possible. That was the deal they gave me. For the next 9 years, the lease was renewed under my name whenever it came due. They lived there, and I paid for the privilege of remaining useful. It started small. The first time was that same summer when my father's unemployment ran out and rent came up short by $200. My mother mentioned it at dinner, not to me exactly, just into the air. "We're a little tight this month." I covered it before she had to ask twice. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It was never a one-time thing. There were other things too, smaller ones, the kind that don't show up on any ledger. My birthday landing on a Tuesday, nobody remembered until I mentioned it Thursday. My mother describing my job to relatives as, "She types things into a computer." My younger brother Curtis, 4 years behind me, getting a car co-signed the year I got a lecture about being careful with money. When I did well at work, the table went quiet. When I struggled, they were interested. My value in that house only ever pointed one direction, toward what I could give. I learned to keep records, not out of strategy, out of instinct. I found out about the account by accident. I'd left a joint checking open from years back, from when my mother said she wanted to help me build savings, and I'd more or less forgotten it existed. Then a card got declined at the pharmacy, which never happened to me, and I went home and checked, and $340 was gone. When I asked my mother about it, she didn't even look guilty. "You weren't using it," she said. "I figured you wouldn't miss it." She said it while folding a towel, like the towel was the thing that needed her attention. Not the fact that she'd used her access to take money I had earned without asking me. The money was already spent. There was nothing to get back. After that, I closed everything they could reach and opened accounts they knew nothing about. But part of the money I was saving to leave, cash I did not want appearing on any statement they might find, went into a steel lockbox under the false bottom of my closet, behind the winter boots. I remember one holiday around then, Thanksgiving, the whole extended family crowded into that small dining room. My cousin had just gotten engaged, and my aunt was showing the ring around the table, and my mother held my cousin's hand and said, "Isn't it wonderful when your children build a real life?" I was 30. I'd just gotten a raise I hadn't told them about because I'd learned that good news from me landed like static. I sat there with my hands in my lap and understood that a real life, sure she's in that house, meant a life they could take credit for. Mine wasn't that. Mine was just the one that paid the shortfall. That box was the only thing in that house that was mine. I want you to remember the box. It comes back. By late 2023, I was 32, and I had stopped waiting for that table to go quiet in my favor. Let me tell you what my life actually looked like then, because the picture matters. I was still in the same house. My room was the smallest bedroom, the one at the back that got no morning light. I worked days at the brokerage, where I'd been passed over for a coordinator role twice, both times by men who asked me to train them. In the evenings, I came home to the sound of the television and the smell of whatever my mother had reheated. And I ate at the counter because the table was where the mail piled up. And every few months, rent came up short, and I transferred whatever was missing. No one thanked me, because gratitude would have meant acknowledging the arrangement out loud. There was one night that fall I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside. The porch light was out. It had been out for a month. My father kept saying he'd change the bulb. Through the window, I could see them on the couch, blue light on their faces, and I thought, I am 32 years old, and the only role I have in that house is the one that pays. That same week, rent came up short again, $310. I moved it over from an account they didn't know existed. I'd been saving for new glasses. Mine had a hairline crack running through the left lens that split streetlights into two. And I told myself the glasses could wait. The glasses always waited. I don't tell you that number to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because a few $100s at a time, several times a year, over many years, adds up to something. And I was keeping track, every transfer, every screenshot, not because I had a plan, because keeping records was the only power I had, and some part of me couldn't let it go. Somewhere in there, I started to understand something that changed how I saw the whole arrangement. For years, I'd told myself that signing that lease, covering that rent, being the reliable one, that these were gifts I gave freely, and freely given, they made me good. But sitting in that cold car, it landed differently. The role they'd handed me wasn't a gift at all. It was a harness. They'd found the one person in the family who couldn't say no, and they'd fitted her to the load. And then They'd called the load love so she wouldn't try to take the harness off. Once you see a thing like that, you can't unsee it. I sat in the driveway that night and saw it for the first time, clearly, all the way down. The thing that changed my life didn't feel like a turning point when it happened. It felt like a favor. Deborah Foley managed the laundromat 2 blocks from the brokerage, a narrow place with 8 dryers and a bell over the door. I'd been going there for years because our machine at home was always somebody else's turn. One evening, she was at the counter with a shoebox of receipts and a look on her face like she wanted to cry into them. Her bookkeeper had quit, her quarterly taxes were due, and she didn't know a debit from a credit. I offered to help. Just that night, I sat on a folding stool between the folding tables and sorted her whole year in about 3 hours while the dryers hummed. 3 hours later, I had reconciled the worst of the accounts and flagged nearly $400 in sales tax payments that appeared to have been duplicated. She tried to pay me, and I said no. She put $200 in my hand anyway and closed my fingers around it. "Your head does more than that place is letting it do," she said, tipping her chin toward the direction of the brokerage. "You're wasting it there." I drove home with $200 I'd earned with my own mind, not given as a duty, not owed to anyone. I sat in the driveway again, under the burnt-out porch light, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't dread keeping me in the car. It was a question. What if Deborah was right? The next year was the hardest and the best of my life, and most of it happened at that laundromat's back table or in my dark bedroom after midnight. I decided to build something, not to escape in some dramatic way. I didn't have the money for drama. I decided to take the one thing I was actually good at, numbers and paperwork and the patience to read the fine print nobody else would, and turn it into something that belonged to me. The first real step cost me almost nothing and terrified me anyway. I studied nights, completed a professional bookkeeping course, and earned its certificate. Then I did something that felt strangely enormous. I registered as a notary public. It's a small thing on paper. You complete the state's requirements, pay the fee, receive the commission, and buy a stamp. But when that stamp arrived in the mail, a heavy little self-inking thing with my name curved around the edge, I held it in my hand for a long time. It was the first object in the world that said, in raised letters, that I was allowed to make something official. Deborah referred me to the man who owned the hardware store, and he referred me to his sister, who ran a home cleaning business, and by the middle of 2024, I had 6 small clients. Monthly bookkeeping, basic tax preparation after additional training, and notary work by appointment. In my first strong month, the side income crossed $1,800. I did all of it from the laundromat's back table because the fluorescent hum was easier to think in than my parents' television, and because Deborah left the light on for me. It was not a clean climb. I want to be honest about that, because the version where a woman decides to build something and everything goes right is a lie, and you'd know it was a lie. My first real setback came early in 2024 from a man named Brent who ran a lawn care outfit and hired me to catch up 2 years of books. I did nearly 40 hours of work, and when I sent the invoice, he stopped answering. $1,100 gone. I had no signed engagement letter and had taken no deposit. I'd trusted a handshake because I was still the girl who thought being agreeable was the same as being safe. I never saw that money, but I learned. After Brent, every client signed an engagement letter and paid a deposit before I opened a single spreadsheet. It cost me $1,100 to learn to protect myself. Cheap in the end. The second setback nearly ended everything before it started. During my first tax season, in early 2024, I was doing books all day and basic returns half the night, running on 4 hours of sleep and vending machine coffee, and I made an error on a client's return, transposed 2 figures on a small business schedule, the kind of mistake that would have put a notice from the IRS in his mailbox and my name on it. I caught it 3 days after I'd filed, at 2 in the morning, going back through my own work because something had been nagging at me that I couldn't name. I sat at the laundromat's back table and looked at that number for a long time. The dryers had stopped. Deborah had gone home hours ago and left me the key, and I felt the old pull, the one that whispered that maybe he'd never notice, maybe it would slip through, maybe I could just hope. It was the same voice that had told me for years to keep quiet and keep giving and not make waves. I called him at 7 that morning. I told him exactly what I'd done before he knew anything was wrong. I told him I'd already prepared the amended return and would cover any penalty caused by my error. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "You called me before I even knew there was a problem. Most people would have hidden it and prayed." He stayed. He's still my client today. And later, at my office open house, he told that story like it was the finest thing anyone had ever done for him. That morning taught me the thing that would end up mattering most, that being the person who owns the truth first is a kind of power nobody can take from you. I would need that lesson later, in a bright room, with my parents standing in front of everyone I knew. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I met Nadine Mercer. Nadine was a CPA in her mid-50s who'd been doing taxes in that town for 30 years and was starting to talk about retiring. I handled the monthly books for a florist whose year-end taxes Nadine prepared, and we got talking one afternoon over the florist's messy quarterlies. She looked at my work, then looked at me over her reading glasses. "How much are you charging for this?" I told her. She actually laughed, not unkindly. "You're charging about half what it's worth. Do you know why?" I didn't. "Because you keep waiting for someone to give you permission to matter," she said. "Nobody's going to hand you that. You just decide it, and then you charge like you've decided it." I didn't have an answer. I filed that sentence away with the receipts and the screenshots, in the part of me that kept everything. By the spring of 2024, the work had started to feel real in my hands. I picked up the dentist's office and a small trucking company in the same month, and my monthly income crossed $2,400, and I bought a proper laptop to replace the failing one I'd been using for years. Small things. But each one was a brick, and I was the one laying them, and no one could tell me the wall wasn't mine. Through all of it, the certification, the clients, the stamp, the near disaster, the slow climb from $1,800 to $2,400 a month, my family noticed none of it. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular because it was the last one where I still tried. That summer, I'd landed the trucking company, my biggest client to date, and mentioned it at Sunday dinner the way you'd offer someone a piece of good news you were proud of. My father was mid-story about Curtis's fantasy football league, a story that seemed to go on forever and involved a trade Curtis had made that my father clearly considered a masterstroke. When I finished my sentence about the trucking company, there was a small silence, the kind where you can feel a table deciding whether to care, and then my mother said, "Did you remember my prescription?" And my father went back to the fantasy football trade. That was the phrase that started attaching itself to me around then, the one my mother used like a fact about the weather. "Shirley's never home." She said it like an accusation. She had no idea what I was building in all those hours away. Neither did I entirely, but I was about to find out that Nadine wasn't just a mentor. She was a door. Late in 2024, Nadine told me she was retiring for real at the end of the next tax season, and she wanted to talk to me about her clients. She had close to 40 clients, small businesses, a couple of nonprofits, a dentist, and 3 restaurants. She could have sold the practice to a larger firm 2 counties over. Instead, she offered to introduce me to the clients she believed I could handle and let each of them decide whether to make the transition. No buyout I could not afford, only a modest transition fee tied to the clients who actually chose to come with me, plus her personal introduction and a gradual handoff through tax season. "You're ready," she said. "You've been ready. You just kept waiting." 12 chose me in the first wave after tax season, and several more followed over the next few months. By the middle of 2025, monthly revenue had crossed $5,500. After expenses and taxes, the business was finally bringing in enough to replace my office salary. It was more than my job. It was a business. I gave the brokerage notice in August and stayed through the end of September while I finished the client transition. Then the thing happened that made the town start to see me. The Regional Small Business Bulletin, a little publication that goes out to every shop owner and chamber member in the county, ran a short feature. It was Deborah's doing mostly. She'd told the woman who wrote it about the quiet bookkeeper who had helped a growing group of local shops turn shoeboxes of receipts into usable records. The piece was 4 paragraphs. It had my name in it. Shirley Watson, who has quietly become the person a growing number of local businesses trust with their books. I read it standing in the laundromat. Deborah framed a copy and hung it above the change machine. It was the first time in my life my name appeared in public attached to the word trust, and I stood there and felt something I didn't have a word for, something between pride and grief for all the years nobody had used that word about me at all. That feature did what a good business does. It made the phone ring. It brought several inquiries, and 3 became paying clients within 2 weeks, and it made me do the math I'd been avoiding. I could afford to leave. Not just the job, the house. I had enough monthly income and savings to leave my parents' house and lease a small office in my own name, with room left to rent a modest place to sleep. I started looking quietly at a small storefront on the east side of town, a former insurance office, $900 a month, with space for a desk, 2 client chairs, and a morning-facing window. I also found a modest studio nearby that fit the same budget. I remember standing in that empty office one evening in September, the temporary showing key still in my hand. The room smelled like fresh paint and old carpet. Streetlight came through the front window and lay across the bare floor in a long, pale stripe. And I stood in it and imagined a desk there, 2 chairs there, a sign on the door with my name on it. Just my name. Not Watson family anything. Not a name I'd signed on behalf of someone else. Mine. I thought about the girl at the kitchen table in 2016, 25 years old, signing a lease with a shaking hand because it was the only time anyone had needed her. And I thought, that signature made a home for people who never once made room for me in it. This signature was going to make a place for me. I had not signed the office lease yet, and I had told no one at home. It was still a secret I was holding close, the way I'd learned to hold everything. But for the first time, the secret wasn't a wound I was hiding. It was a door I hadn't opened yet. What I did not know was that, while I was looking at office leases, my father had begun asking around about what my bedroom might rent for. Part of me later wondered whether telling them sooner would have changed anything. The honest answer is that it probably would have made them move faster. Here is where I bring you back to the lawn. I'd never taken a real vacation on my own, not once in my adult life. That October, with the client transition steady and a storefront lease still waiting for my signature, I booked one quiet week away. 7 days somewhere warm, by myself, the first week I had ever spent not being useful to anyone. I told my parents I'd be gone. My mother said, "Must be nice," in the voice she used for things she resented, and I let it go, because I was learning to let things go. While I was gone, my parents rented out my room. They moved in, a man named Kurt Ramsey, through a listing my father had posted before I left, though I would only learn that later. And they charged him $650 a month for the back bedroom with no morning light. They replaced the lock on my bedroom door so Kurt could have what they called privacy. They carried everything I owned onto the front lawn and left it there through the afternoon. I came home from the airport on a Sunday evening, still a little sunburned, the first easy feeling I'd carried in years, still warm in my chest. I saw the boxes on the grass from the end of the street. At first, my mind refused it. I thought there'd been a flood, a repair, some reason my things were outside. Then I saw the shape of my own life laid out on the lawn in the damp. My clothes in trash bags, my books spilling from a split box, the little lamp from my nightstand lying on its side in the grass with the shade crushed. My front door key still worked. The key to my bedroom did not. I stood in the hallway, turning it against a deadbolt that no longer recognized me, while a stranger's television murmured a laugh track on the other side. There's a specific kind of cold that comes over you when a familiar door suddenly refuses your key. It isn't anger yet. It's disbelief wearing anger's coat. I walked back around to the porch, and that's where I found the steel box, on the step, lid open. While clearing the closet, they had found the false bottom, hauled out the steel box, and pried its lid open. I crouched down and looked inside it, and it was so empty it seemed to have never held anything. $6,800. 2 years and 4 months of not buying the glasses, of covering their shortfalls, and still setting aside what I could, dollar by dollar. In the one place I thought was safe, gone. Cash left me without a clean record of who had taken it. All I knew was that the box had been opened inside a house they controlled. My mother was on the couch. She didn't get up. She didn't turn the volume down. "You're never home anyway," she said. "The room was just sitting there." My father came out of the kitchen, saw my face, and chose the tone of a man who had already decided he'd done nothing wrong. "It's extra income. God knows we could use it. You've got that little side thing. You land on your feet." "Where is the money from my box?" I asked. Neither of them answered. My mother only turned the television louder. "That little side thing. I want to tell you I said something devastating. I didn't. I stood in the doorway of the house whose lease and liability were in my name, and I felt the old reflex rise up, the one that wanted to make it okay, to fold, to be agreeable, so they'd stop being cold to me. I felt it, and for the first time in my life, I let it rise all the way up and then set it down. I said, "Okay." That was all. Okay. My mother took it as surrender because that's what okay had always meant from me. She actually looked pleased. I carried my life off the lawn box by box, alone, in the dark, under the porch light that had never gotten fixed. And then I sat in my car, and I did not cry. I called Deborah, and she said, "Come to the laundromat. The back table's open. The light's on." When I reached the laundromat, I stayed parked with 2 garbage bags of clothes in the back seat and made the other call. I called Glenn Osborne, not to ask for anything. I asked him one question. I asked him whose name was on the lease. There was a pause on his end, the sound of papers moving while he checked the lease file, and then he said, "You're the only tenant and responsible party on the lease, Shirley. Your parents are listed only as occupants. Why, is everything all right over there?" And that was the moment the whole shape of the last 9 years turned over in the dark of that car. Everything all right over there. He didn't know anything. He knew they lived there. He did not know I had been covering their shortfalls or that they treated my signature as though it belonged to them. He didn't know they'd sublet a room in his house without telling him, which he confirmed violated the lease's written ban on subletting, without the landlord's consent. He did not know that more than $14,000 of the rent shortfalls had come from me. I knew because every transfer was screenshotted and filed. He only knew one thing, the same thing the lease itself said in plain language, the same thing my parents had forgotten the second it stopped being convenient to remember. The name on the lease was mine. I was the only person authorized to renew it, and I had the right to decline renewal and end my own responsibility when the term expired. And the lease was up for renewal on December 1st, a little more than 6 weeks away, which meant I could stop renewing and Glenn would decide whether anyone else qualified for a new lease. My parents could not sign in my place. I didn't say any of that to Glenn. I said, "No, but I need to handle it carefully. Can we review the lease together this week?" He said, "Of course." I hung up. I sat in the parking lot of the laundromat with the engine ticking and Deborah's light glowing through the window, and I understood that for 9 years I had been holding the ceiling of that house up with my bare hands, and no one in it had ever looked up. They were about to look up. I met Nadine 2 days later, and I brought the lease. I'd found my copy in a folder I'd kept. Of course I'd kept it. And I laid it on her kitchen table next to a mug of coffee, and I watched a retired CPA who had read 10,000 documents, read this one slowly, twice. "You're the sole tenant and financially responsible party," Nadine said. "Your parents are listed only as approved occupants. They cannot renew this lease or replace your signature with their own." "They think the house is theirs," I said. "They've always thought that." Nadine folded her hands. "Then Glenn needs to explain what happens when you decline renewal. I can help you read the numbers, Shirley, but the landlord should confirm the notice." She paused. "And keep those transfer records. They may not recover the money, but they prove exactly how long you have been carrying this arrangement and which direction the support was really flowing." Then she said the thing that decided it. "You can renew one more time and keep carrying the liability, or you can decline and let Glenn handle what follows. That's not revenge. That's gravity. You've been fighting it for 9 years. I sat with that for a long moment, because letting go meant they'd have nowhere to live, and no matter what they'd done, that thought had weight. The girl who'd signed the pen at 25, the girl who covered the $310 and skipped the glasses so a bill that wasn't hers would get paid. She was still in me, and she was already halfway to a solution. She was already thinking, I could renew it one more time, just one more year, and quietly start looking for them a cheaper place, and handle it and keep the peace, and no one would have to be uncomfortable. I actually opened my mouth to say a version of that, to fix it, to be useful, and then I thought about the box on the porch step. Lid open, empty. I thought about my mother not turning down the volume on the television while she told me the room was wasted on me. I thought about 9 years of covering the shortfall and being called selfish the one time I stopped. "I'm not renewing," I said, "but I'm doing it through Glenn, exactly as the lease requires." Nadine nodded slowly. The next morning, Glenn walked me through the lease procedure. Written non-renewal notice, delivered more than 30 days before December 1st, plus a formal report of the unauthorized sublet. It was simply the documented shape of a woman withdrawing a signature she no longer agreed to lend. That week, I signed both leases, the storefront on the east side and the modest studio nearby. The office was $900 a month in my name with the morning window. I ordered a sign for the door, and over the next month, I prepared an open house for the last Saturday of November, to introduce my business to the community properly. Clients, the woman from the bulletin, anyone who wanted to come. Nadine said she'd be there. Deborah said she'd bring the good coffee. I gathered every screenshot of every transfer, printed them, and put them in a folder. I placed copies in the steel box for the symbolism and kept the originals locked in my office file cabinet. My parents didn't know any of it yet. Glenn had told me he'd need to speak to them directly to sort out the unauthorized tenant as a matter of procedure. I asked him to wait only until my written notice was delivered that week. He agreed, while documenting the unauthorized sublet immediately. The notice was delivered by certified mail on Thursday. Glenn called my father Friday morning. I wasn't there for the phone call, but I've been told about it enough times to see it clearly. My father was at the kitchen table with his coffee when Glenn called to explain politely that the tenant of record had given notice not to renew, that the lease would end on the 1st of December, at the unauthorized sublet would have to be resolved under the lease and proper notice procedures, and that going forward the current lease could not be renewed without Shirley, and any separate lease would require Dale and Cheryl to qualify on their own. My father said, "What do you mean Shirley's the tenant? This is our house. That paperwork was only a formality." And Glenn, 66 years old and unfailingly polite, said, "The lease has only ever had one tenant, Dale, Shirley. You and Cheryl are listed as occupants, not responsible tenants. I assumed you understood that." There was a silence on my father's end. I imagine him standing in that kitchen where he'd slid a pen across a table 9 years earlier, where he'd said the word formality like it cost him nothing, and I imagine the exact moment the arithmetic of it landed, that the house he'd called his for 9 years had never been his at all, that the daughter he'd thrown onto the lawn was the hinge the whole thing swung on, and that he had insulted and robbed the one person whose signature stood between him and the street. That was the moment. That was when my father's phone hit the kitchen floor and skidded under the refrigerator, and he had to get down on his knees on the linoleum to find it. My mother told me that part later, not as an apology, just as a detail she couldn't stop thinking about. Her husband, on his knees on the kitchen floor, reaching under the refrigerator for the phone because their daughter had finally, quietly, stopped holding up the sky. By that afternoon, they'd figured out where I was. They came to the laundromat, both of them together, which they almost never did. My father led with volume, the way he always did when he'd lost the high ground and needed to take it back by force. "You don't get to do this," he said. "You signed that lease for us, for your mother and me. That was the deal. You don't have the right." I was at the back table with a client's file open in front of me. Deborah stood by the counter and did not leave. I closed the file. "I signed it," I said. "So the renewal decision and the liability are mine." "That's a technicality," my mother said. She'd found her softer voice, the one she used when volume wasn't working. "Surely, you're not going to put your own parents out on the street, over a room, over a little bit of extra money we needed. What kind of person does that?" There it was, the version where I was the cruel one, where 9 years of holding up their roof disappeared, and the only fact left on the table was a daughter who wouldn't sign. It's a remarkable trick if you stop to notice it, the way a person can take everything from you and then, the moment you reach for the door, ask what kind of person you've become. For years that trick had worked on me. For years I'd looked at my own hand on the doorknob and let go, because I couldn't stand to be the kind of person they'd just accused me of being. Not this time. This time I looked at the accusation and I recognized it for what it was. A tool. The last one they had. "You put a stranger in my room," I said. You threw my things in the yard. You emptied my room, and $6,800 disappeared from the steel box you left pried open, and you did all of it while I was gone, because you were sure I'd never do anything about it." I kept my voice level. Nadine had been right about that too. Calm was louder than any shout I could have managed. "You were right about who I used to be. You're just late finding out I'm not her anymore." My father changed tactics. "Fine, then renew it. Sign it one more time, and we forget this whole thing. We'll deal with Kurt and give him his money back. You just renew it one more time, we go back to normal. You have until December 1st. You want to be a good daughter, that's how you do it." A deadline. Sign by December 1st, or be the villain. I didn't argue with him. I'd learned that arguing was just giving them more surface to push against. I said, "I heard you." And I let the silence sit until it was uncomfortable. And then I said, "There's an open house at my new office the last Saturday of the month. You're welcome to come. You should see what I've been doing all those nights I was never home." I don't think they understood what I was inviting them to. I think my mother heard it as a peace offering. I think my father heard it as an opening to work on me in front of people, where I'd be too polite to say no. They said they'd be there. Good, I thought. Be there. The last Saturday of November, my office was full. I'd hung the sign that morning, just my name and what I did in clean letters on the glass. Shirley Watson, bookkeeping, tax, and notary. The morning window did what I'd hoped it would, throwing a long rectangle of light across the front room, across the 2 client chairs, and the desk, and the little table where Deborah had set up the good coffee, and a tray of the lemon bars she only made for things that mattered. They came, the people I'd spent 2 years earning. The hardware store owner, the florist, the man whose return I'd caught the error on, who told that story to anyone who'd listen like it was the finest thing anyone had ever done for him. Nadine, in a good coat, standing near the window like she'd known this room would exist before I did. The woman from the bulletin came because she was preparing a follow-up on the new office. Glenn stopped by briefly after I invited him as the landlord who had watched my business begin at a borrowed kitchen table. My parents arrived a little after 11. I watched them come through the door expecting one thing and finding another. My father had the posture of a man who'd come to make a scene, shoulders squared, chin up, already scanning for the moment to raise his voice and put me back in my place in front of my little crowd. And then the room registered on him. The people, the coffee, the sign. The way the florist touched my arm and said something that made me laugh. The way a stranger with a notepad was writing my name down like it was worth recording. He slowed. My mother slowed beside him. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything, and I watched them do the math they'd never once done. The math of what all those nights away had added up to. My father recovered the way he always did, by getting louder. "Shirley, we need to talk. This is a family matter, and it can't wait." The room went quiet, not because he'd commanded it, but because that's what a room does when a man raises his voice at a woman in her own space. I set down my coffee. I did not raise my voice to match his. I'd decided a long time ago that I would not win this by being louder, because being louder was his only skill, and I had better ones now. "It's all right," I said to the room. "This is my father, Dale, and my mother, Cheryl." Then I turned to them, and I said the thing plainly, so that everyone in that bright room could hear it, and there would be no version later where it hadn't been said. "You want to talk about the house, so let's talk about the house. For 9 years, that lease has had one responsible tenant, me. Not because I own the house, I don't. Because in 2016, no one would rent to you, and you needed someone with clean credit, and I signed. And when the rent came up short over the years, I covered it. $14,000, a few hundred at a time. I have every transfer. I nodded toward the steel box on my desk, where copies of every transfer sat inside the bent lid. I kept everything. My father opened his mouth. Glenn Osborne, standing near the window, spoke first, not dramatically, just a landlord stating a fact. That's all correct, Dale. Shirley is the sole tenant and responsible party on the lease. It has been since day one, and I wasn't told about the gentleman renting the back room, which I'm afraid isn't permitted. He said it kindly. He said it the way you tell someone the truth, when you have no reason to soften it and choose to anyway. My mother tried the soft voice one more time, in front of everyone, which was a mistake. Shirley, sweetheart, this isn't the place. You told me the room was just sitting there, I said. You said I was never home. You were right. I wasn't home because I was here, building this. And it turns out the person you decided was worth $650 a month to replace was the only reason you had a roof to rent out at all. Nobody moved. My father's hands had gone still at his sides. My mother's mouth was open with no soft voice left in it. The florist had set down her coffee. The man whose return I'd fixed was watching my father the way you watch someone realize they've walked into the wrong room. Nadine stood by the window with her arms crossed and the faintest, proudest tilt to her chin, like a teacher watching a student finally do the thing she'd always known they could. The room held the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that's full of everyone understanding the same thing at the same time. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't, not exactly. What I felt was quieter than that and stranger. I felt the 34 years of it, every shortfall I'd covered, every birthday they'd forgotten, every time I'd sat in the driveway under a burnt-out porch light, unable to make myself go in. I felt all of it settle, finally, into its true shape. Not a debt I owed. A weight I'd been carrying for people who'd told me it weighed nothing. The lease ends on December 1st, I said. I've already signed one of my own. On this door. In my name. I let that sit. That's the difference between us now. You spent 9 years telling me the house was yours because I signed for it. I finally learned the lesson you taught me. I signed. So the choice to renew was mine. My non-renewal was already delivered. There was nothing left for them to pressure me into signing. Nothing they could take from a room full of people who'd watched me build it. The notice period was almost over, and my own leases were already signed. It was, in every way that mattered, legally, practically, publicly, already done. My father looked around the room one more time, and this time he didn't find a single face that was on his side, and he understood that too. He turned and walked out. My mother stood there a moment longer, and then she followed him. And the bell over Deborah's borrowed coffee setup, she'd brought it from the laundromat, didn't ring because it was a different door, but in my memory it does. Kurt Ramsey chose to move out the next day after Glenn explained the unauthorized sublet, and Kurt chose to leave after Dale agreed to return his deposit. Glenn told him the situation, the daughter, the yard, the box, and Kurt, who wasn't a bad man, just a tenant, packed his things and left, and did not keep quiet when neighbors asked why he was leaving so suddenly. In a town that size, everyone asks. Within a week, the neighbors knew exactly what my parents had done to their daughter while she was on the first vacation of her life. I did not need a lawsuit to stop renewing the lease, and I did not need revenge to make the truth visible. There was just the truth, walking itself up and down the street on its own 2 feet. I saw them one more time in the final days of November, at the house, to collect what remained and settle what still needed saying. Glenn had served the required notices, and the rooms were half-packed. Boxes stood by the door, their boxes now, not mine. It's a strange thing to stand in a house you repeatedly paid to keep from falling behind and watch the people who threw you out of it pack to leave. My father tried blame first. If you'd just told us sooner what you were doing, none of this would have happened. You let us walk into it. You didn't walk into anything, I said. You locked my door, emptied my room, and left my steel box pried open with the money gone. Nobody made you do that. My mother sat at the table, the mail cleared off it now, finally, and did the thing I'd waited 34 years to hear and no longer needed. We didn't think it would matter this much to you. You were always so easygoing. That wasn't easygoing, I said. That was me, hoping if I gave enough, you'd finally see me. You never did. You just saw what I could give. Curtis was there in the doorway, 30 years old, and still protected from responsibilities the family had always handed to me. He said quietly, not quite looking at me, we should have done better. I should have said something. It was late. It was small. It didn't undo one day of it. But he said it, which was more than either of our parents managed, and I let it be what it was. My Aunt Lorraine, my mother's older sister, had come to help them pack and was wrapping dishes in the kitchen. She'd never lived with us, but she'd seen enough over the years. She caught my arm on my way past and said the truest thing anyone in that family said to me. I always knew you were the one carrying all of them. I should have said so out loud, years ago. I'm sorry I didn't. An apology, real and late, from someone who'd only watched. It landed somewhere in me and stayed. It didn't fix anything. It wasn't supposed to. Here is what I said before I left, because I'd promised myself I would say it clearly, and only once. A person makes a mistake, and you forgive the mistake. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice you made over and over for 9 years, and then one more time when you thought I was too far away to catch you. I'm not going to pretend those are the same thing. I picked up the last of my boxes. I'm not cutting you off. If you're in real trouble someday, call me, and I'll help you the way I'd help anyone, as much as I would help a decent stranger. And never again by sacrificing my own stability. But I'm done holding the ceiling up. I'm done covering the shortfall, and I'm done waiting for you to tell me I mattered. My mother said, "Where will we even go?" I thought about the boxes on the lawn. I thought about my things in the wet grass and the lamp with the crushed shade. You'll figure it out, I said. That was what you told me, wasn't it? The room couldn't just sit there. And I left. It's the middle of December now, and I want to leave you somewhere warmer than that. My parents have moved into a short-term rental, and Glenn has taken back possession of the house. My office is busy. Tax season is coming, and my calendar is nearly full, and I've hired Deborah part-time to run the front, giving her fewer hours at the laundromat, and giving my office the woman who first saw what I could do. The morning window does what I hoped it would do every single day. Clients come in cold and leave warm. Nadine stops by sometimes, drinks my coffee, tells me I'm still undercharging, which I'm not anymore, and she knows it. I've had my first few Tuesday evening sessions with a counselor because getting out from under a thing isn't the same as being healed of it, and I'd spent so long being useful that I'd never learned to just be. I'm learning. It's slow. It's mine. Last week, a young woman came in, someone starting over, rebuilding a small business out of the wreck of a bad marriage, no money for a bookkeeper. I gave her one free setup session, then built a payment plan she could actually manage, the way Deborah once refused to let me refuse her $200. I know what it does for a person when someone sees what they're building before it exists. My parents sent a short text a few days ago. 3 sentences. It included the word sorry without naming exactly what they were sorry for. I read it twice, and I didn't answer it, not because I want them to suffer, but because an apology isn't a key that automatically opens a door. It's just a knock. I'll decide, in my own time, whether I want to answer. That's mine to decide now, too. The steel box sits on the corner of my desk, lid still a little bent. I never had it fixed. I like the reminder. It doesn't hold hidden cash anymore. It holds my notary stamp, my commission certificate, and signed copies of the leases for the small, ordinary, hard-won life I built, while everyone who was supposed to love me insisted I was never really there. On my way out each night, I lock the door behind me with a key that fits, a door whose key belongs to me, and whose opening and closing are finally my choice. And I think about the one that didn't fit. The night I stood in the dark, turning it, while a stranger's television murmured on the other side. I survived them. I rebuilt myself from the parts of my life they had treated like disposable things, and I don't need any of them anymore to tell me that I matter. If you've ever been the one quietly holding a family up, the person they called only when they needed something, then called selfish when you stopped giving, tell me what finally made you let go. The debt may never have been running in the direction they told you it was,